who feels that attitude of disrespect and disregard by the political governing institutions of class? And in the Western Cape, it's basically the rural areas that feel this, the wine growing areas, the agricultural areas, people like that, rather than Cape Town. Now, the interesting question is, if you want, maybe the unit that needs to break away is both separately. Maybe the appropriate way of dividing up South Africa would be to have a number of major political, major city regions, and then a lot of, rural regions, which would be a much more better way of doing it.
Hello, my name is Donald, and welcome to the #1 media company, WorldView. At WorldView, we explore everyone's perspectives on all things that can broaden our worldview. Today, we're talking again with Dr. Stephen Davies. The doctor is the head of education at the IEA, and he has authored several books that we will display on the screen, like The Economics and Politics of Brexit and The Streetwise Guide to the Devil and His Works. So, Doctor, thank you for making the time. It's always such a great pleasure to talk to you. So, Doctor, we have in South Africa, we have this movement, Cape Independence movement, that wants the Western Cape, the capital is Cape Town, to break away. Yeah. And this movement is slowly growing in support. It recently had a Cape Independence rally. And I thought it would be great to ask your opinion, because there's some similarities between Cape Independence and the Brexit movement. And so, first of all, my question is, was it smart of the pro-Brexit forces to divide into three separate organizations, like the Boris Johnson, Dominic Cummings organization, the Labour Party one, and the Nigel Farage organization? Was that a smart move, or was it perhaps smarter to coalesce under one organization?
I actually think that was a smart move, for two reasons, really. One is that with a major political decision like secession, which is what Brexit is in a way, seceding from the EU, people may well want to do that and agree that it should be done, but have very different reasons for doing it. Now, if you have a single organisation, what inevitably is going to happen is that there's going to be an agreed line, which means that some of the sort of arguments that might persuade people to vote for that outcome or support that outcome are not going to be made. Whereas if you have different campaigns, they can make different kinds of case for it. In the Brexit case, the thing is that many people had very different ideas about why they wanted to leave the EU and what they hoped would happen afterwards. So there was a small but vociferous, what you might call Lexit, as it was called, socialist case for leaving the EU, which was that the EU was a capitalist or neoliberal conspiracy, and that the reason for leaving it was so you could have, socialism, full-on socialism. Had he lived, Bob Crow, the leader of the RMT union, would have been a very forceful advocate of that case. Obviously, that's not going to persuade people who want to leave the EU because they hope that it's going to lead to a free market economy, or who want to leave because of nationalism, although there's an overlap with that one. And so it actually made sense to have three different campaigns. And the one that Nigel Farage led, Lead.eu, was essentially making the case for both nationalism, but also at the same time, rather strangely, globalism. So it was this global Britain idea that he was pushing. Dominic Cummings, who was definitely the brains behind the campaign that Boris Johnson was fronting, made the argument, on the contrary, that it would enable the British government to get more control of immigration policy, spend more money in the NHS, basically have its own industrial policy, which of course is completely incompatible with the argument that Farage is making. So it actually helped in terms of getting the maximum number of voters behind the cause, that there was more than one argument for it, because that made it obvious that it's actually, you can support this end outcome, secession, even though you may disagree quite strongly about what comes after that is done.
And I mean, Jeremy Corbyn would probably never admit it, but he's probably one of the Lexit members.
Oh, yeah, I'm sure he is. I mean, he denies that he voted leave, but I would not be at all surprised if in the privacy of the voting booth he voted leave. Throughout his entire political career, he'd been anti-EU ever since he came into Parliament in 1983. He was one of the most consistently anti-EU MPs in Parliament, in fact. And he was conspicuous by his absence from the Yes campaign, I think it's fair to say. I think he made two not really enthusiastic speeches, and when he was asked in a an interview how he rated the EU. He gave it 7 out of 10. And you have to respect his honesty, but I'm sure his handlers must have been tearing their hair out at that answer.
Hello, everyone. If you're interested in advertising on WorldView, drop us an email at worldview.help@gmail.com. We will send you an advertisement guide, which will include the rates and the process involved. A typical shout out for your company or project will be between 45 and 60 seconds. By advertising on our platform, you'll be supporting a company that wants to improve the public narrative. Once again, send us an email at worldview.help@gmail.com, which you can also find in the description below. Now, back to the interview. What's also not so clear is Theresa May, because she was also to a degree absent from the what do you call it, the other side organizations' meetings. So do you think she also was perhaps a soft Brexit supporter?
No, I think she was a kind of reluctant leave person. I think she was representative of actually quite a large number of both voters and politicians who were not really enthusiastic about the EU, saw it in purely pragmatic terms as a kind of advantageous economic arrangement rather than a political project, which is a very widely held view, but didn't think that the no vote was ever going to win. But on the other hand, also, and this shows politically astute judgment on her part, she wanted to cover the basis, so just in case what she thought was the low probability outcome of a vote to leave happened, she would be in a position to take advantage of it, because she wouldn't have identified herself so strongly and explicitly with the Remain cause. So because she was a very ambitious woman, I mean, she had her eye on the top job, like most politicians who've held the great offices of state do.
Doctor, how powerful do you think slogans are in politics? So, for example, the "Take Back Control" slogan that was used during Brexit, do you think that was really a tiebreaker?
Yeah, that was a stroke of genius on Dominic Cummings' part, that slogan. Slogans can be enormously powerful. And this is true in advertising, it's true in politics, it's true in other areas of life as well. The thing is that most slogans don't have this effect, but every so often one comes along which crystallizes in a very succinct and memorable phrase or image a kind of sentiment or feeling that a lot of people have, which they've not been able to articulate. And what the slogan does is to capture that sentiment in a very powerful, arresting phrase. And once it's implanted in the minds, if you like, of a lot of people, it then becomes very hard to shift if you're opposed to it, because you have to deconstruct not only the ideas behind the slogan, but the kind of sentiments and feelings that people have, which make that slogan resonate with them. And that's very, very difficult. So slogans can be tremendously powerful. And the knack really of great political operators is to know when you've got a winning slogan. Because, as I say, for every slogan that does have that kind of effect, there's at least a dozen, maybe even 100 that, it's just like water off a duck's back. Most advertising people will tell you that, for every campaign that is a great success and, creates a permanent link between a product and a slogan or an image, there's a, 20 or 30 which just, have no effect whatever.
And I mean, I think that the powerful thing of "Take Back Control" is it's sort of ambiguous. It's sort of to tie it to political realignments. I can see it almost working in any political realignment, because there's that feeling of during a political realignment of not having control anymore.
Well, one of the reasons why it was a particularly brilliant slogan was because it finessed the question I alluded to in one of my previous answers, that of, well, okay, if this happens, what do you do next? If you know what I mean. Because it's just about get back control. Once we've got back control, then we can have an argument about what to do with this control that we now have. That was the subtext to that slogan. And that's very powerful, because it means that you, the Leave side, who with that slogan are able to avoid confronting the actual quite tricky argument about, well, okay, what are you going to do? Now, this is true more generally in politics, though. The sentiment that slogan appealed to is a very widespread one in many parts of the world, a feeling on the part of many voters that things are being done to them and that political policy is being made in a way that takes no account of their interests, their worries, their concerns, their feelings. And I think therefore, this idea that somehow they want to get back control of the decisions, have an actual say in the decisions that affect them, this is a very, very powerful sentiment in many, many parts of the world. And it reflects a serious weakness in the contemporary political systems in many parts of the world. And it's one of the things that is driving realignment, undoubtedly. I think it's got two aspects. One is excessive centralization. Modern states are very often much, much too centralized. That's particularly the case in the United Kingdom, but it's also increasingly true in other countries. But the other, even more important thing is the domination of government and governance by a class of credentialed managerial technocrats. And this is something you find all across the world. The rule of so-called experts, if you will. And this is something which is causing really severe pushback across the political spectrum, interestingly, because you can object to the rule of these technocrats from any kind of political perspective. You could be a conservative, a liberal, a socialist, whatever, and not like the fact that a bunch of guys who have apparently some entitlement coming from the fact that they've got a degree or a PhD are sat there in the central bank or government bureaucracies or agencies and telling you what to do and making decisions supposedly on your behalf, but without even having the decency to ask you what you think.
And how powerful was the argument around illegal immigration? Was it necessary to bring up the topic of illegal immigration like Nigel Farage did?
Yes, it was necessary, but on the other hand, it wasn't as important as people think it is. There's a common notion on the Remain side that the bulk of the people who voted Leave were motivated by the desire to prevent foreign immigration. All of the polling evidence after the referendum, where people were asked subsequently why they voted the way they had or how did they feel about certain things, shows that that's not the case. It was not actually a major factor for a lot of people. To the extent that immigration was a factor for a significant number of Leave voters, the concern was not so much with stopping immigration as with being in charge of it. The perception was that the British political system had lost control of the borders because of EU freedom of movement rules. Now, actually, it turns out, as I think quite a few people should have known beforehand, that another major factor is the complete and utter incompetence of the Home Office, but that was another story. But there was, however, a minority for whom stopping foreign immigration was a very big issue. Now, what that means is, on the one hand, it was not a big issue for the bulk of Leave voters, but it was a big issue for a minority of Leave voters, and that minority was crucial to getting over the 52% margin. So it was both important for getting the 52%, but not that important an issue for the bulk of people who contributed to that 52%. So both of those things are true at the same time.
So it's a question of illegal immigration to some voters, a minority, was an extremely passionate issue. And by talking about it, you got those people on board.
Yeah, precisely. You've got those people on board. And in particular, that group of voters are people who, for various other reasons, were disproportionately likely not to vote or take part in the political process. So by focusing on that issue, you got a relatively small number of voters engaged and prepared to vote who otherwise might not have voted. And that was a crucial thing in getting to 52%, even though, as I say, the majority of that 52%, about 40% out of that 52%, didn't really care strongly about the issue, or actually were quite relaxed at immigration, just wanted British politicians to control it.
Do you think political analysts sometimes underestimate the issue of immigration and illegal immigration? Because it seems like, okay, it's not that a big factor, but it easily differentiates yourself from other parties. It's something that you can easily use to other someone else. So it's saw a big rise in the US under Donald Trump, and we see another political party in South Africa, Action SA, that's also beating that drum, and they're getting a lot of support quickly. So, yeah.
Yes, there are two things to say here. The first is that this is one of those areas where there's a split between what you might call the technocratic elite and also a larger social group, which is basically middle-class professionals who live in large cities on the one hand and the mass of society on the other. The first group of people, the elites, the policymaking elite and the sort of, like I say, middle class professionals in the metropolitan areas, they are relatively relaxed about immigration, or they positively favour it. The bulk of the population, on the other hand, however, are much more concerned about it. So that's the first thing to say. It's one of the fault lines in the new political divisions we can see. However, it's not so much immigration per se that is the big cause of agitation. What I think people are really agitated about is what they see as uncontrollable change. People who say they're concerned about immigration, it turns out they're actually equally concerned with migration, fully, including migration within a political entity. So in the UK, for example, there are lots of people in Cornwall or Wales who are really upset and annoyed by the migration of wealthy suburbanites from London and the home counties who are buying up all the properties in rural Wales or Cornwall and making it impossible for the locals to afford to buy a house. Now, that's not immigration, it's migration within the country, but it's the same phenomenon, which is movement of people and also money with them in many cases, which brings about a major social change. And a lot of people don't welcome the change. They feel very uneasy about it, or they feel that they're losing out from it, or they feel that the familiar, what they're used to, is being removed, and they feel very disturbed by that. And the problem is that our political class is not addressing those anxieties. Now, personally, I'm an open borders man myself, so I favour free migration, but you have to recognize, if you take my view, that a lot of people are very uneasy about the social and cultural implications of large-scale migration. And if you're a politician who wants to make that case, you have to address those concerns. You can't simply get away with it by saying, oh, these people are just ignorant xenophobes. Nor can you get away with it by simply saying, oh, there are big economic benefits to be gained from this. There are. But the point is that the concerns people have, although they may often be expressed in economic terms, when you drill down and you ask people in more detail why they're bothered about this, it's actually non-economic concerns that are really behind a lot of the anxiety. And I know this is a big problem in many parts of Africa. I mean, you alluded to South Africa, migration from Zimbabwe, for example, from Mozambique, Angola into South Africa is very large scale. You've also got major movements within South Africa from the rural areas into Gauteng and the other big metropolitan areas. But it's true in Nigeria. I mean, in Nigeria, it's a really big issue in places like Lagos and Ibadan, the mass migration that you're getting, not only from northern Nigeria, but also from across the border in Upper Volta and from other Mali and Niger and places like that. And you're getting exactly the same kind of reaction you are in South Africa, serious pushback by the mainly Yoruba speaking population of southwest Nigeria in particular against this kind of migration. So it's a global phenomenon, this, and it's a mistake to think of it in the kind of reductionist terms in which a lot of people do think about it. It's a much more tricky issue.
But I mean, Doctor, don't you see this issue only becoming more and more of a bigger problem? Because I mean, globalization, technology, change is just going to become more. This just going to get more and more change. So these voters are just going to become more and more anxious.
Yeah, well, yes, it is a problem, undoubtedly. But as I say, I think what we have is a political failure. Now, one of the things to do, I think, is to contrast the way the political class is dealing with this kind of question now and the way it was dealt with in the 19th century. In the 19th century, you had population migrations on a scale which is even larger than what we have now. The migration from within Europe and around the world at that time was absolutely massive, partly because of imperialism, by the way. So that's why, for example, the population of Fiji is now 45% Indian. A few years ago, 50% Indian, actually, because the British Empire encouraged mass labour migration out of the Indian subcontinent to places like East Africa, South Africa, hence all those Indians in Natal and Durban, all the way across the Pacific and to the West Indies. There was huge migration from East Asia into Latin America, not to mention all of the hence people like Alberto Fujimori and his daughter in Peru, also mass migration to the United States. Now the thing is, this did not lead to the kind of political or social response that we see occurring today. And I think there are two reasons for this. One is that we didn't have welfare states. a lot of the hostility to migrants comes from the welfare state, because people deeply resent the perception that the incomers, the blow-ins as they call them in Ireland, are taking what they see as welfare benefits that they, the established population, have some kind of proprietary rights to. Now, that completely misunderstands what the modern welfare state is, but that's beside the point. This is a sentiment which is very, very powerfully felt. And so when there isn't a welfare state, you don't get the same competition between ethnic groups, incomers, and established populations for basically the taxpayer's largesse. And that actually removes a lot of the causes of hostility. But the other reason, I think, is that the political class was much more astute and adept in its handling of it, which is that they deliberately took symbolic but profoundly significant steps that calmed down the anxiety of the settled population, the host population that was receiving all the immigration. They emphasized symbolic movements, which led the people to think, well, there may be a lot of new people moving in here. We may have a lot of Germans suddenly moving into Texas or something like that. But there are some things that are still there. We still have the Constitution, we still have the flag. Similarly, in Britain, people deliberately build lots of buildings and have lots of public rituals which emphasize a kind of historic connection to the medieval past. And this led people to think, well, okay, everything is changing, but at the same time, there's this kind of continuity. That was very astute cultural politics, and it mitigated a lot of the tensions. Not to say the tensions weren't there. So Vienna, for example, got massive immigration of largely Jewish people from the Pale of Settlement in Russia and what was at that time part of Austria-Hungary, Galicia, into Vienna and Budapest. And this did provoke quite a strong reaction. But even so, I think it was less severe than what we're seeing now.
So what you're saying is essentially the individual, instead of the state, took responsibility for this lack of cultural this cultural problem that arose with migration by building these buildings. And essentially it's always the state that's the problem. It's hindering
I think the state had a role to play here, but as I said, the role of the state in that period was largely through public symbolism and ritual. It also helped, perhaps, I mean, I am a Republican myself, but it may well have helped that many of the states at that time were monarchies, because one of the things a monarchy does bring is a kind of symbolic continuity with the past through the line of descent and all that. And so the anxiety about change that is such a powerful feeling at the moment faced with this migration, that was much alleviated. Having said that, I think you're right that this phenomenon of mass migration is going to continue, and the politics that arise from it are also going to continue. And it relates to the kind of point you alluded to at the top of the show about secession movements such as the Western Cape, because what has happened at the moment is you have a globalized economy, but not all of the world has become globalized at the same rate. And the globalization, the division is not between parts of the world, but within parts of the world, because the bits of the world that have become highly globalized are large metropolitan cities, places like Gauteng, for example, which is basically Greater Johannesburg plus Pretoria, as you know. The world economy now really, we should think of it as being like a kind of spider's web network of about 2,000 major cities. That's what the world economy is. And so that what you actually get is migration, not so much from one part of the world to another. That's one way of thinking about it, but it makes more sense to think of it as being essentially migration from rural parts of the world to large metropolitan cities, which may be in the same country that you originate from, but which may not. So what you've got in, say, Nigeria, which I alluded to, is basically migration from large parts of West Africa into Greater Lagos, or into Accra. Similarly, what you've got in India, for example, is migration both within India and increasingly from outside India into places like Mumbai, Bangalore, places like that. And so the problem is we've got this increasing division politically between the cities, which are coping with but also benefiting from this large flow of people, and the rural areas. And the trouble is that our political structures, our political borders increasingly do not correspond with the actual meaningful economic and social and cultural units of the world. We really need a mass redrawing of borders. And this is a point that is often made about Africa because of the legacy of the Berlin Conference and the way the Europeans carved up Africa in this completely arbitrary way that year. But it's true, I think, for the world more generally.
Yeah, no, I think the carving up of Africa did severe damage that we're still seeing to this day. It's probably the worst result of colonialism, arguably. But Doctor, how do you, on that note, how do you get people from the from the rural areas and the urban cities in a movement like Western Cape Independence to get together to argue for the same issue, because they're so polarized? They're two separate people, but obviously you need them both if you want an entire province to secede, because you also see in Cape Town the support for Cape independence is much lower than in the rural areas. It's really the rural areas driving the support for secession. The people in the cities, they don't want to secede.
No, well, that's because of greater localism in the rural areas. If you live in somewhere like Cape Town or Durban or Johannesburg, you're as closely connected to remote parts of the world as you are to your immediate hinterland. You can get on planes and fly to London, Paris, New Delhi, New York quite easily. And so you will tend to be very aware of those global links and connections. Whereas if you're living in the rural Western Cape, or for that matter, rural Transvaal or any other one of the rural parts of South Africa, you're going to be much more aware about your locality and also the degree to which the central government is ignoring you, basically, and just taking you for granted, basically. And so that's why there tends to be a kind of strong sentiment there. On the other hand, if the national government was dominated more by the rural areas, then you might well find more support for seceding on the part of the cities. So in the UK, for example, there was a mostly humorous, but with an undertone of serious idea after the Brexit referendum that London should break away from the UK and become a city-state and apply to join the EU. And I think that, to the extent that if London ever was to feel that the rest of the country was basically embarking on a course and a path that the people in London itself really, really didn't like and was not in their interest, you might well get a kind of movement for London to become a city-state. So I think it's a question of who feels that their ox is being gored, essentially. Who feels that attitude of disrespect and disregard by the political governing institutions of class. And in the Western Cape, it's basically the rural areas that feel this, the wine growing areas, the agricultural areas, people like that, rather than Cape Town. Now, the interesting question is, if you want, maybe the unit that needs to break away is both separately. Maybe the appropriate way of dividing up South Africa would be to have a number of major political major city regions and then a lot of rural regions, which would be a much more better way of doing it. What I do think, and I think this very strongly, is that modern states are much too centralized. I'm a great admirer of an almost forgotten political thinker called Leopold Kohr, who wrote a major book back in the 1960s called The Breakdown of Nations. And Kohr argued that the big problem with most modern states was that they were just too big in terms of the number of people they contained, not so much the geography. And that small states were generally more effective, had better functioning politics than large ones. And the empirical evidence of studies since then confirms his point. And so I'm strongly of the view that we should be looking to break up existing large states into much smaller units. And the division between country and city, I think, means that in many cases, what you should be doing is breaking up existing large states into a combination of city-states and rural, larger rural, geographically larger, that is, rural areas.
Is there evidence during the medieval ages of the success of smaller states? Is the fact that Italy and the Holy Roman Empire was so decentralized? I believe they were very successful. Italy was an extremely powerful economic hub. So was it because they were so decentralized and they were divided into smaller states as opposed to France or England.
Yeah, arguably, yes. I mean, the thing, one of the ways of understanding this is to say that um, when you have lots of small jurisdictions in close proximity, as long as there's reasonably free movement between them, and that's a very important proviso, then what you get is competition between those different units. And not so much military or political competition, but although you did get that, but rather competition in the arts, in discovery, in intellectual life, and in economic life. And that competition process is a discovery process, as Friedrich Hayek said. It's the way in which you find new things. And therefore, Lombardy, northern Italy, was very, very dynamic, as indeed it still is. I mean, there's a legacy from this. Similarly, southern Germany, Germany south of the Main, places like Franconia, Swabia, Westphalia, which were divided up into literally hundreds of tiny little counties, duchies, imperial abbeys, much more dynamic than, say, northern and eastern Germany, the flat plains north of the Main. And that comes from this competition between many, many small jurisdictions. As I said, though, there is a very important proviso, which is that there needs to be free movement. If not, and this is what began to happen in Germany as the centuries went by, you start to get lots and lots of tariff barriers between the different units. And that's actually extremely bad because, of course, it means that instead of having one large free trade zone, you have tiny little free trade areas with lots of barriers between them, which is extremely bad economically and in other ways. So that's the important proviso. So radical decentralization, and the Middle Ages is an example of this, as are other parts of the world like Southeast Asia, or indeed many parts of Africa actually, brings enormous benefits as compared to having large centralized states or empires. But there is that important proviso. You do need relatively free movement, or at least as much free movement as possible between those small units. The obvious contrast in Italy, by the way, you mentioned Italy, it's northern Italy that is subdivided. Southern Italy, what became the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, were originally the Norman Kingdom of Apulia and Sicily. That's a highly centralized single state, and it does not enjoy the success of the North or the dynamism of the North. And even to this very day, northern Italy is dynamic, very rich, very successful. The Mezzogiorno, as it's called, the southern region of Italy, south of Rome, is an economic basket case. And always has been for a very, very long time. So these things have very long legacy effects.
Interesting. Do you think that's also why both Italy and Germany was quite powerful when they united right before the First World War?
Well, what happened in both of those cases was that the problem that you have in, let's say, 18th century Germany and Italy is that you have a slightly smaller number of states by this time, but they're all aiming for economic self-independence because they're guided by a particular kind of development strategy known as cameralism, in which each state seeks to be what one person called a closed commercial state. And what this did, of course, was to, it split the whole German market into about 100 and something separate little bits. And so it became very important when the Zollverein, as it was called, the customs union, was created, which brought about free trade within Germany. And then Germany is unified, and they get the initial benefit of suddenly having, 70 million people all in the same economic and political unit, and with a great array of talent and natural resources and ability and inventiveness. And the result is very substantial economic growth. The tragedy, in my view, was that there was the way that happened, because Germany was unified by Prussia, which was a state with a very different kind of tradition. And it led to a kind of top-down industrialization, which ultimately had disastrous results. Personally, if you want to think about your druthers, it would have been better if two different Germanys had appeared, because there is a profound dividing line in Germany, roughly on the line of the Main, between northern Protestant Hochdeutsch Germany, which is Prussian Germany, if you will, and southern Catholic liberal Germany, which south of the Main. And the critical turning point really was the Austro-Prussian War in 1866, 1867, sorry, which meant that the southern part of Germany became incorporated into the subsequent German Empire because of the defeat of the Austrians. But that's all, unless we can get a time machine and go back. We are stuck with the legacy we have. But yeah, there was a benefit to unifying these areas because of the way after 1648 Germany and Italy became the free movement that you'd had during the Middle Ages basically stopped, and you had a much more controlled system of movement and trade.
And if Germany probably were divided along those lines, it's potential we could have perhaps not seen a First or a Second World War.
No, we wouldn't have seen this, I think. I mean, at the peace conference in 1919, Clemenceau famously said, "I love Germany so much, I wish there were more than one of her." And I think actually, had the Allies in 1919 been sufficiently tough-minded, that is what they should have done. They should have partitioned Germany, I think, because the problem once Bismarck had created Germany was that it was too big and too powerful. It dominated Europe, no matter what it was like. But also at the same time, it put together very different traditions, very different political ways of approaching the world. The fact they all spoke the same language, it really is a secondary matter. As any German will tell you, there's a huge difference between Germans and Austrians, even now. All kinds of sort of sarky things said about each other by those two parts. And it's similarly, I think it would have made more sense for Germany to be at least two countries rather than one, and it probably would have been more peaceful. But who can tell? This is.
But I mean, was it really so difficult to break up Germany? Because the Allies had no problem breaking up Austro-Hungary and to destroyed Austro-Hungary.
No, unfortunately, it was because it was partly because the Americans, Woodrow Wilson, were convinced by the idea of national self-determination, and they applied this in a rather inconsistent way. So they wouldn't let the Austrians unite with Germany, which in theory, if you apply that principle, they should have let them do it. But on the other hand, they didn't want to break up Germany because they saw that as being a violation of that. But the big problem was that the Allies in 1918 had agreed an armistice with Germany. Now, Ferdinand Foch, the Supreme Allied Commander, was totally opposed to this. And Foch said, look, if you do this, the Germans will feel that they've not been beaten because they've not surrendered. They've only agreed to an armistice. So that means that therefore they're just not going to accept, and you will not be able to impose really far-reaching or harsh terms. Had the war continued into the spring of 1919 and the German army completely collapsed, as it almost certainly would have done, and the Allied armies crossed the Rhine and gone into Germany, then it would have been very obvious that Germany was totally defeated and it would have surrendered. And the Allies would have then been in a power to do things like undoing Bismarck's unification. But as it was, they agreed instead, against Foch's strong objections, to an armistice. Now, in practice, it was a surrender because the terms of the armistice were staggeringly harsh and the Germans had to basically give up most of their equipment. So it was a surrender, but it was crucially not presented as being a surrender. So Foch was completely correct. But, of course, you can see why the politicians ignored him because having, the number of deaths, they'd had 20 million dead already by the autumn of 1918, you'd have had to be incredibly tough-minded and ruthless to say, no, we're going to continue this war for another 6 months and have another, 500,000 people die. I mean, you can see quite well why Lloyd George and Clemenceau and the others did, accept the idea of an armistice when it was proposed. But that was the reason why they couldn't do it.
Yeah, talking about Austro-Hungary made me think about the Velvet Divorce. I don't know if you're familiar with Czechoslovakia breaking up into the Czech Republic. What is the story there? Because I've done some research on this, and it seems like there wasn't even a referendum. The elites just decided, okay, we're going to divide this. That's
very Czech, I have to say. The Czechs they're sort of self-images. There are people who will do almost anything to avoid conflict. Most countries have a patriotic novel about a war hero. The Czechs have the good soldier Švejk, who is a soldier who is drafted into the Austro-Hungarian, the Imperial and Royal Army of Austria-Hungary, and manages to live through the Great War by various kind of devious ways of avoiding actual combat, usually by presenting himself as a total idiot, basically, so that his commanders don't ever put him in harm's way. That tells you something about the Czech sort of like image of themselves. But I think also it was a realization. I think it was a classic example of how you can have a peaceful dissolution of a national state, where both sides realize that there's more to be gained by separating than trying to force people to stay together. In other words, there isn't a national image. It helped that historically there was very little connection between the two parts because Bohemia and Moravia, the old kingdom of Bohemia, had been part of Cisleithania and Austria for hundreds of years, before then a separate monarchy in the Holy Roman Empire. Slovakia had always been part of the Kingdom of Hungary for a very, very long time, almost 1,000 years. They'd never really been in the same political unit. And so, although they'd been in the same unit after Masaryk got the Allies to create Czechoslovakia in 1918, this was based on this kind of notion that Czechs and Slovaks were basically the same people, when even at the time people knew perfectly well that no, there was a difference. Even though they spoke pretty much a very similar language, there were enough differences that it didn't really make sense to think of them as one people. And so there was only 60, 70 years or so of being in the same state. And it was pretty obvious that the obvious sensible thing to do was just divide the state. Now, I think, for example, that if Scotland was to vote to be independent in the UK, which I would support personally, then I think you would have a similar, very peaceful dissolution. And there are other precedents. So Norway, historically for a long time part of the Kingdom of Denmark, became part of Sweden, the Kingdom of Sweden, in 1815. But in just after, I think it was 1909, there was a referendum in Norway, and Norway voted to become a separate state. And again, that was completely peaceful. The Swedes didn't make any fuss about it. So I think that you can have these kind of peaceful dissolutions of unions. It depends really on whether or not the dominant national group have a vision of what their national identity and country is that means that they find a secession unacceptable. So in Spain, for example, if the Catalans were to vote to secede from Spain, or the Basques, the problem there is that the Castilians have a vision of their Spanish identity, which is tied up with the idea that there's one Spain that includes all of the Iberian Peninsula bar Portugal, and they have a sneaking feeling that Portugal ought to be part of Spain as well, I think. So that would actually be much more fraught. The Czechs' vision of what their country was didn't have containing Slovakia as a vital element of it. Similarly, I think the English, increasingly in Britain, they're not too bothered, or might even be secretly quite delighted if the Scots were to become independent.
Why did why is it called the Czech Republic and not Bohemia anymore? Because I mean, it
Oh,
was known for Bohemia for a long time.
yeah, because the Moravian, they want to placate the Moravians. So, and also it's just a matter of Czechia, or the Czech Republic, is nice and snappy, whereas the Republic of Bohemia and Moravia, which is what you'd have to call it, is a bit cumbersome, that. But at least they've got a name which is, they could have called themselves the Kingdom of Bohemia or the Crown of Bohemia, but they're not a monarchy anymore. But it's at least they've got a reasonable name. They're not like Macedonia, which had to call itself the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia for a long time because of the Greeks, manic obsessions about that subject. I think that now calls it South Macedonia, which is, like, again, bizarre. But yeah, that again illustrates the kind of problem that you can have to do with national self-image.
Hey, you made a very interesting point. So to a degree, it would be politically smart, to convince the other side that it's better if you seceded, that you went your own way. So, for example, if Scotland convinced the rest of the UK, it's actually better if we went our own way, or if the Western people in the Western Cape convince South Africa, it's actually better if we just. So that it's smart to convince the other side. Yeah, we should. It's better for both of us if we went.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, this is true in politics generally. You are not going to win the argument or win it in a peaceful or reasonable way if you say to the other people, well, I want to have this and it's going to cost you, but too bad because I'm going to get it. That's the way to have a fight, whether you're talking about it in a bar or in politics. So the way to, if you want to break up a state, if you are in a secessionist movement, the position to take is that this is actually going to be better for both parties And in many cases, it is. I mean, I think the Czechs and the Slovaks both think it was the best thing they ever did, splitting up Czechoslovakia into two. So that is very often completely correct for all sorts of reasons, political, economic, and otherwise. But that's definitely the line you should take. Yes, you should not imply, oh, that's why the kind of rhetoric of, oh, we are getting out from under your oppression, you swine, and you just got to go in there and take it, is not smart rhetoric. It may wind up your own side, but it's also going to wind up the people you need to convince to let you go without a fight. And so that's, as you quite rightly say, that is the correct way to go.
But yeah, we have a unique situation in South Africa that the governing party, for all intents and purposes, is a corrupt criminal organization, the ANC. So they literally want the Western Cape to stay part of South Africa because they thrive off the looting. I think 1 out of every 4 rand taxpayers' money gets returned to the Western Cape. They're literally stealing from the Western Cape. So they have no incentive to let the Western Cape go.
Yeah, well, this is true generally. Now, what you find in country after country is that there is one part of the country which is generally generating a disproportionately large share of GDP, and typically it's getting back a very small amount of the money it pays in taxation. Now, this can have rather bizarre sort of implications, though. In the United States, for example, the bits of the US that are constantly like puffing out their chests and saying, oh, we might think about seceding again, like Texas and some of the red states, they're actually net recipients. The places that pay all the taxes are the blue states, primarily, places like New York, New Jersey, California, and so on. And actually, going back to your original point, in the American case, there is a lot of increasingly serious talk about maybe the United States ought to be split up. Personally, I think this would be a wonderful thing, but increasingly people are talking about the United States as being like one of those really unhappy marriages where the couple have to either divide the house into two and somehow barely live together, or actually just split up and call it a day. But the blue states there they really ought to be quite glad if places like Mississippi or Alabama vote to secede, because at the moment they're costing them an absolute bloody fortune. Now, the same is true in places like South Africa, where you have a ruling elite or a ruling group, if you will, which is basically drawing money from the productive parts of the country to enrich itself. But this is not unique to South Africa, to put it mildly. It happens all over the place. And of course, it's worth saying, I mean, as you obviously know, in South Africa, the union, when it was formed in 1910, was actually formed by putting together what were at the time 4 independent states. I mean, the Transvaal and the Orange Free State had been separate states before they were conquered in the Boer War. Natal and the Cape Colony were both separate colonies with their own separate distinct colonial governments. This goes back a long way. And after the Great Trek, the Boers set up, quite a few little states up in the belt. I mean, eventually only 2 of them survived, but originally there were quite a lot of them. My own favourite one was the Klein Freistaat, the Little Free State, which had a 1-line constitution, which was that nobody was allowed to set up a government. That was their only constitutional provision. So there's a kind of historical record for decentralization, and one of the crucial things for federalism to work, which is a kind of halfway house between the unitary state and complete division of the state, is that there can't really be interstate transfers of the kind you're talking about, or that I was talking about in the context of American state. That is not sustainable in the very long run. If you have a federal state with local units which are to some extent autonomous and self-governing, you can't hope to ultimately carry on if you've got one of those self-governing units clearly seeing that it's being exploited and ripped off by other parts. That's just not sustainable. You can see the same thing in Canada, where Alberta is constantly really irritated by the fact that it's generating a huge amount in revenue for the Canadian state, which is then being dumped in large amounts on Newfoundland and the Maritimes, or even more annoyingly, Quebec, which is what really upsets them. So that kind of transform, shipping money out from one part to another is always going to undermine any kind of federal state in the long run.
The secession movements in the United States, isn't that also driven by tying it back to the migration talk, isn't it driven by immigration, that people are scared that California voters are coming to Texas and they're voting Democrat? So what would one's argument be against that policy, that free immigration leads to voters coming to your boundaries, voting the same way they did back in their own states?
Well, the point is that's always been the case in the United States. One of the things about the US is that it's a continent-wide free trade and free movement area, and always has been. That has always been by design the way the state is. I don't think people in Texas are bothered about, at the moment anyway, about people coming from California. They're actually rather feeling quite a lot of schadenfreude at the idea that Elon Musk and other people are leaving California to come and live in Austin or Dallas. Again, I think within the United States, it goes back to the point I made earlier. The real divisions are not between states, but within states. Within Texas itself, for example, there's a clear division between places like Greater Austin, Greater San Antonio, Houston, and Fort Worth, Dallas, and the rest of the state. It's the split between the rural areas and the large metropolitan cities, which are increasingly, in American terminology, liberal as opposed to conservative, particularly Austin, the state capital, of course. Similarly, in Arizona, for example, there's a big division between Greater Phoenix, Sun Valley, and Tucson on the one side, and the rest of the state, the rural part of Arizona on the other. So yes, I think there is a lot of tension about this, but I think the solution for the Americans is to actually break the states up. I mean, what America should do, in my view, speaking as an outsider who wishes them well, is to initially turn the 50 to 60 largest metropolitan areas into states. And moving on from that, to actually break up quite a few of the states, particularly the much larger ones, and end up with about 300 cantons. And that would, I think, be with free movement between those cantons, but with each canton being self-sufficient and self-governing, no transfers of money between one canton and another, and therefore a massive reduction in the role and scope of the federal government. And I think that would resolve a lot of the pretty severe cultural conflicts that we have in the United States at the moment, because right now, with the likely striking down of Roe v. Wade, what we're going to see is enormous political tension at a state level, because that decision is going to hand the decision about whether or not abortion should be allowed or not back to the state legislatures and state electorates. Now, that's going to cause big divisions. Some states are going to have it very freely available, other states are going to restrict it. But because many states are so geographically large, it's going to mean that a lot of women who want an abortion, for example, are going to have to travel an extremely long distance to get it. Whereas if you broke the states up into about 300 cantons, because of the size of the country, some people unavoidably would be faced with long journeys. But you would find that pretty much all the areas where there's a majority in favour of one position or the other would be able to get their way, and the costs imposed on people from that would not be too high. And the same could be true in South Africa. So I remember in South Africa many years ago, two very well-known South African libertarians, classical liberals, Leon Lowe and Francis Kendall, wrote a little book called Let the People Choose, I think it was called, which advocated breaking up the Union of South Africa into about 70 or 80 small cantons, essentially. I think they were based upon the court districts. And again, it was to turn the South Africa into something like Switzerland. And this was proposed as a way of dealing with the problem of, obviously very acute at the time, because this was written under apartheid, of race relations. But it would apply equally now. It would be a way of getting round the problem you allude to of having a kleptocracy, which is basically plundering productive parts of the country and using it to enrich its immediate supporters and clients.
On the issue of Roe v. Wade, it's hard to see, at least for me, to see sort of a middle ground there, because I have sympathy for both sides. I mean, at the end of the day, you want something to be solved at the federal, local level. But I mean, if that results in the person having to travel a far distance to get abortion that she might not have wanted to be in a situation, that's also not really realistic, pragmatic. So how do you see a sort of a middle ground there?
Well, I think a middle ground will ultimately emerge, but it's going to be quite fraught getting there. The United States is an outlier where abortion is concerned. In every other developed democracy, there's a consensus which has emerged through the political process, which is pretty much the same everywhere. And that is that you have free abortion in the first 14 to 16 weeks. You then have abortion highly restricted in the next 3 months. And, it's allowed, but only under very, very specific circumstances. And it's pretty much banned in the last 2 to 3 months, apart from incredibly rare eventualities. Otherwise, it just doesn't happen. And so essentially, that is the consensus that most political systems are thrown up. Free abortion in the first 3 to 4 months, highly restricted or completely banned in the rest of the pregnancy. Now, that doesn't please the moral absolutists on either side. It doesn't please the people for whom life begins at conception and any abortion is murder. And it doesn't please the people who believe in complete bodily autonomy and think that you should have the right to terminate a pregnancy up to the moment before the child is delivered. But those people are actually a minority. And this is a classic case of how the political process is meant to work. What it is meant to do is to come up with a modus vivendi between clashing principles, which the majority who don't care that much about these principles, quite frankly, can live with. And the political process, pretty much every other country has done its job. It's arrived at this modus vivendi. And if you don't like it, if you are, for example, a pro-choice or pro-life fundamentalist, if you will, then you just have to campaign against it. But good luck with that. The problem the Americans have is that they chose, when they had the Roe v. Wade decision, to do it through the courts and by appeal to constitutional principle rather than the political process. And the result is that the extremists on both sides have been able to set the terms of debate. And this has continued because it suits the politicians on both sides, because it enables them to raise large amounts of money and to panic their supporters and demonize their opponents and generally keep the political show on the road. It's utterly cynical in my view. That's why the Democrats have never done anything like writing a federal law to entrench Roe v. Wade, because they know that being able to hold on the bogeyman that's now become real of the decision being overturned helps them raise a lot of supporters. The Republicans, for their part, I think a lot of smart Republicans, if there are such things, are currently panicking that they've actually finally got Roe v. Wade overturned, because I think their actual secret hope was, let Roe v. Wade be overturned, but not just yet, because it was, again, a great way of mobilizing their base, raising funds, demonizing their opponents. But now the Americans are going to hand it back to the political process, where I think they should have left it in the first place. And I think that eventually, after about 10 to 15 years, they will end up in the same place as every other Western democracy, with the kind of compromise I've described. But it's going to be very, very fraught getting there, because there's now a lot of people on both sides who are very angry. This split between these two people maps onto a whole lot of other social and political splits in the United States. The state borders, as I say, are too big in many cases, or have too many people within their borders. So you're going to get the kind of problems you alluded to, that I referred to. So it's going to be an interesting and rough 10 to 12 years for the United States, but I think they will ultimately arrive at the kind of morally unsatisfactory but politically viable compromise that I mentioned.
Doctor, yeah, interesting. On that note, what is sort of unspoken after every political realignment is the correction on the other side. So, for example, for Margaret Thatcher, you got Tony Blair. For Ronald Reagan, you got Bill Clinton. There was that correction on the other side that realized, okay, we have to do this a different way. How do you see a fourth way arising from the current situation in response to Boris Johnson and Donald Trump? Because obviously, at this very moment, they're not doing it right. I mean, Joe Biden and what's his name, Starmer in the UK, they're not obviously, if you look at the opinion polling, they're not doing it right. How do you see them getting the upper hand and getting that super majorities that Tony Blair and Bill Clinton got?
Well, I think two things will happen. One of them, which you can see happening with, say, Emmanuel Macron in France, who's been successful so far, is a kind of technocratic liberalism that is moderately anti-woke, if you will, and which tries to address some of the concerns of the people who are supporting, say, in his case, Marine Le Pen. So if you look at the rhetoric that Macron has been coming out with and his ministers have been coming out with, they're trying to appeal to or to assuage the sort of anxieties we were speaking about earlier on over migration and the like. So a few months ago, about 6 months ago, Macron's own interior minister actually said that Marine Le Pen was too soft on Islam. It's like, you what? That's a bit striking. But that's what's currently going on at the moment. And so what Macron and people like him are trying to do is to, on the one hand, placate but not concede too much to the national collectivists, as I call them, the people who support people like Trump or Le Pen, while at the same time distinguishing themselves from the radical left, in his case Mélenchon and La France Insoumise, on the grounds essentially of anti-wokeness and supporting the existing institutions. Now, that is what Joe Biden would like to do and what the smarter people in the Democrats would like to do. The problem is, I think that poor chap, he's not quite up to it, basically. Plus, he's been confronted, to be fair to him, with a kind of perfect storm of problems. I mean, there are all kinds of problems that he has no control over, like the war in Ukraine and the increasing problems of rising energy costs and things of that sort, which are completely outside his control. However, I don't think that's a viable strategy for what you might call the liberal cosmopolitans in the long run, because the great weakness of that position is that it ties them to the technocratic managerial approach to politics, which I mentioned, which Emmanuel Macron personifies perfectly. He is the quintessential technocratic manager. He, as the French call him, an énarque, a graduate of the École Nationale d'Administration, to give it the full name. And he won quite comfortably in the end, but an awful lot of people who voted for him did so with a very heavy heart and very reluctantly, because they didn't want Marine Le Pen, but they really, really don't like Macron. He really annoys them. Why does he annoy them? Well, because they feel he's this condescending, supercilious, arrogant bureaucrat, which nobody likes people like that. And so the big problem with the what you might call the cosmopolitan liberal side in politics, which I would broadly define myself as belonging to, is that they're still too closely identified with the technocratic managerial approach to politics. They don't trust the people enough. That's the thing. They need to rediscover Gladstone's famous, motto: "Trust the people." And I think that what will produce a kind of Tony Blair correction and comfortable political victory, if you will, is, on the one hand, moving to address and alleviate the anxiety that the kind of economic transformation the world is producing amongst many people, given the kind of social and cultural changes they see happening around them, but also moving away from this style of politics, this managerial politics, which has come to dominate every part of the world, really, since the 1980s, I would say, certainly no later than the 1990s. And it's a kind of approach to politics which, as I think the COVID pandemic and the response to it has shown, has really, run out of space. It no longer works to the extent, if indeed it ever did, and it's now causing increasingly serious popular pushback and reaction, which is what's really driving this so-called populist upsurge. Of course, in places like South Africa, you've got the additional problem of a technocratic class which is also corrupt. So you've got the additional problem. You have an unaccountable technocratic elite, which is also, engaged in all kinds of seriously dodgy, barely legal or completely outright illegal activities. And that's a common problem in many parts of the world, of course. I wouldn't say the UK is immune from that, quite frankly. So I don't want to get any high horse here. I don't think we can actually, throw any stones at the moment.
The billions of rands that were made available for the COVID relief fund, literally all of it was stolen by the African National Congress. But so to tie to that, wouldn't it also be a connection to Tony Blair's message, a message of modernization, of anti-bureaucracy? Wouldn't that be an essential message of the fourth way?
Well, no, not really, in the sense that I think there's a kind of reaction against that modernization message. What I think you're seeing in many parts of the world at the moment, and this is something which transcends conventional, traditional left-right economic divisions, is a sort of small c conservatism. There is a reaction against the aggressive hypermodernity of the cultural elite and also of this technocratic elite. People are constantly being told, "Oh, you need to change. You can't do what you want. You've got to go with the flow and get with the message. Be modern." And there's a very strong reaction against this. So I think that actually that is not the way to go. What I do think is appropriate is to develop a politics where you encourage individualism against bureaucracy, but also, like I say, trust people at local level or through voluntary methods to do things on their own account. One of the constantly recurring themes at the moment of contemporary politics administration is the idea that you can't trust people because they are apparently ignorant, foolish, guided by all kinds of prejudices and things that they shouldn't have, beliefs they shouldn't have, and therefore they need to be guided by an enlightened elite. And this kind of attitude is what infuriates and enrages many, many voters, or indeed workers, because you get this in private employment from managers. One of the particularly bad aspects of contemporary working life is the way in which the managers seem to have taken it upon themselves to control and direct not only people's workday experiences, but the whole aspects of their lives, so that you get ridiculous things like people, companies making you do drugs tests or checking that you don't smoke and things, nonsense like this. And this again comes from the same root and origin. It's the idea that there's a kind of enlightened, educated class and a benighted, uneducated mass. And so that's what to move away. That's what you want to move away from. And I think the language of modernization actually is not helpful in this context because it's very much associated now with that sort of managerial project.
But just anti-bureaucratic?
Yes, indeed. I mean, one of the things is people. There's nothing wrong inherently with bureaucracy, but what you want is a bureaucracy which is simple and straightforward. What you find in both the public and private sectors at the moment is bureaucracy which is absolutely intolerable and which makes people's lives miserable because it tries to cover every single possible outcome. You see this constantly in regulations passed by the government or in internal company rules and regulations which try to provide for every possible imaginable contingency. And you simply can't do that. Life is too uncertain, too random to do that. And the result of trying to cover every possible eventuality is that you end up with unbelievably complicated regulations. And trying to observe these or follow them just makes life simply impossible. So people just don't follow them. They ignore them. Then, of course, they're liable to be, caught, if you will, and punished if the people with power decide, on a purely arbitrary basis, it seems to me, that they want to get you anyway, because there's always something they can get you for, because the rules are now so complex that nobody can live without breaking them at some point or other. Now, what you want is for a bureaucracy to be limited and small, but also to enforce very simple, clear rules, rather than incredibly elaborate rules. And partly, I'm not quite sure why we have got in this place. I think it partly reflects the incredibly manic fear of lawsuits, which I ultimately trace back to the extremely dysfunctional and predatory legal system of the United States. And it's spread from there to the rest of the world. But I think it also reflects something deeper, which is the mentality of the social formation, the class I mentioned, the managerial professional class, which is that they want to believe that life can be brought under control. They're not prepared to accept randomness, accident. They want to believe at almost any cost that you can control and plan things. And this is true, as I say, in both the public and the private sector. And this leads to a kind of almost manic refusal to accept that you can't possibly cover every eventuality, or to accept risk, a desire to eliminate all risk, no matter how small, from life, which is one of the major cultural phenomena of our time. And this is a sort of a way of approaching life, which I think is completely run out of road.
Yeah, I think a relevant quote here, if I'm getting it right, is "He who defends everything defends nothing," from Frederick the Great. But Doctor, I was so absorbed in this conversation, I didn't realize we're well over our time. I want to thank you so much again for making time for this, and I want to give you one last opportunity if you want to add something or to plug something.
I would say that generally, one of my basic rules of thumb in politics is that I support secessionist movements. I'm always in favour of breaking up larger states into smaller states, and even medium-sized states into even smaller states. One reason for doing this is that a ruling class or ruler who controls a small part of the planet's surface and population can do a lot less harm and mischief than one that controls a large part of the planet's population. So sure, if the Western Cape has become an independent state, or if the Western Cape and Cape Town, which become two independent political entities, sure, there would be local people who would try to mess up life for everybody else, but they would only be able to mess up life for the people in those parts of the world, which is a lot less than the whole of South Africa. And actually, there is pretty strong empirical evidence that states below a certain size of population have much more functional politics, are much better run, and have much better quality of public service and political life than large and complex ones. So you should go with secession, definitely.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point to finish off on. The idea sort of you need to secede or to federalize the system just so that the politicians can't screw up your life as much if it was more centralized.
Yeah, exactly. But if you think about it, if Vladimir Putin was the ruler of just Moscow, that would be very bad news for the people in Moscow, but it would not be a problem for the whole of the rest of the planet, and particularly the Ukraine as it is at the moment. You know, if Hitler had gone back to Austria in 1918 and become dictator of Austria, bad news for Austria, but not a problem for the rest of Europe. The problem was he went to Germany.
Yeah, or if the Holy Roman Empire had still existed, if it never had unified.
Exactly.
So if it was just a ruler of Brandenburg, he would have attacked Saxony or one of the neighboring states, and then there would never have been a world war.
Yeah.
But yeah, thank you, Doctor. Thank you so much for your time. To our viewers, show your appreciation by liking this video, sharing this widely as possible, and subscribing to our channel. My name is Donald, and you've been watching WorldView.